very excited to have been able to put together this marvelous panel of brilliant people to talk about another brilliant person's wonderful book. I'm going to end with Jesus. And I'm going to start with the order of the commentators who will go after Jesus, starting with Hannah Weaver, my colleague. Hannah is assistant professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia, and she is our resident medievalist at this table, in addition to Jesus. And she teaches and writes about the literature of medieval Europe, and especially England and France, the regions now known as. And she is also the co-host of a podcast called Proust Curious, which I highly recommend to everybody. It's extremely funny and entertaining, which in partnership with Public Books, so she's kind of a media star. And her recent book, which is like Microliteratures from Cornell, is called Experimental Histories, Interpolation, and the Medieval British Past. And it's about how one of the main places that you can find medieval historical theory is surprisingly in interpolations, things that people stick in the middle of texts, and therefore very much in conversation with Jesus's work on microliteratures. She's written on an incredible variety of things, including time in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the relationship of genre to purgatory, and my favorite, the treachery of incomprehensible English, which makes me think of some of my colleagues. So next we're going to have Stathis Gourgouris, who is professor of classics, English, comparative literature and society at Columbia. And I think there's a few other departments in there. Stathis's work addresses the convergence of poetics and politics of modernity and democracy. And he writes on political philosophy, aesthetics, poetics, ancient Greek philosophy, film, contemporary music, and psychoanalysis. And basically everyone at this table has too many books to list all of them. So I'm just going to list a few of the most recent. Does Literature Think? Literature's Theory for an Anti-Mythical Era in 2003. Lessons in Secular Criticism in 2013. The Perils of the One, 2019. Nothing Sacred, 2023. The editor of collections on Freud, Etienne Balibar and Cavafy, and he is also a widely published poet and a sound artist. I only learned this, I knew about the sound artist, I didn't know under the name Count G. So two media stars here, at least two. Bernard Harcourt on my left, Corliss Lamont Professor of Law and Civil Liberties at Columbia and an active death penalty defense attorney, which I'm sure is relevant somehow to this panel, although we don't yet know how. He is Directeur d'études at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. And his most recent books are Exposed, Desire and Disobedience in the Digital Age, 2015, The Counter-Revolution, How Our Government Went to War Against Its Own Citizens in 2018, which it seems to be continuing to do with greater vigor than ever. Critique and Practice, A Critical Philosophy of Illusions, Values, and Actions from 2020. Cooperation, A Political, Economic, and Social Theory from 2023. Is there a more recent one? Almost soon, I bet. And he's also edited Foucault's lectures in French and English. And last, but you're not supposed to look over my shoulder. No,
I can see without my glasses and everything.
The Augustus R. Street Professor of Spanish and Portuguese at Yale, who has a PhD in philology from Salamanca and another in law and social sciences from the École des Hautes Études also. He writes on law and humanities. His bio says in the medieval Mediterranean basin, but it's a lot more than that. And again, just the most recent books, Dead Voice, Law, Philosophy, and Fiction in the Iberian Middle Ages from 2020, Order and Chivalry, Knighthood and Citizenship in Late Medieval Castile from 2010. There's at least 4 books that are published only in Spanish. There's, of course, microliteratures in both English and Spanish. And his current project, tentative title, Law and Humanities, The Question of Fiction, which is emerging in conversation with a series of graduate seminars on law and humanities, for instance, on the idea of fiction, on emotions, which he teaches alongside his wildly popular undergraduate courses, for instance, on Iberian Nights, on the End of the World, and in defiance of the end of the world, rebels, and public humanities. And before I let him talk, I just want to say one word about microliteratures, which is that it may technically be about the margins of medieval and early modern Iberian books, but it's about a lot more. Among other things, it's about how people think and talk to each other, not through official channels, but at the borderlands and secret thresholds of the text, and how they do this across time and space, and how they're transformed through these intellectual and affective crossings, and how they then in turn transform the world. So without further delay, one of the great rebels of public humanities and world transformers, my friend Jesus.
On. Well, what can I say? This is such a generous and undeserved introduction, but I thank you with all my heart. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here with me today. I'm not just grateful, I am also very moved to be here again, a little bit nervous to be amongst you, my friends, my colleagues, the people with whom I have worked for 12 years of my life. And I am happy to see you all in this room where we have shared so many moments of friendship, so many ideas, so many projects, where I have learned so much from you all. And here we have shared the most important thing. We have shared time, our lives. Thank you, dear Julie Peters, for organizing this as a sign of friendship, which is a gift. I have about 8 minutes to talk about a little bit about this book. 8 minutes to summarize many years of uneven, sometimes marginal work. Those of you who remember Julio Cortázar's El Perseguidor know that one can think in 1 minute and a half events that lasted for hours. Somewhere, Paul of Tarso, Saint Paul, said that for God, 1 millennium is like a day, and the day can last a millennium. Obviously, I am neither a character from Cortázar, and in particular, I am not Charlie Parker, nor, despite my proper name, etc. Fill in the blank. So to produce such a summary is perhaps more painful, a bit more difficult, and also slightly embarrassing. This is a book that was hard to write. I had accumulated enormous amounts of material to the point that its volume risked taking over any possible idea I may have had. Not that I have many, but you know. So when I realized that the immensity of manuscripts reviewed and studied throughout the years was about to become an avalanche and kill me dead, I decided to kill it first and wrote a bibliobituary. It's one of the best literary pieces I've ever written, and I'm sorry it will never see the light of day. It's dead itself. Then I proceeded to forget, and I forgot, and forgot. And when I thought I had forgotten enough, both the manuscripts and the details about them, and while I was, like many, being lulled into oblivion myself by the pandemic confinement, I started writing once again. I did not want to produce a general, all-encompassing theory of microliteratures, because those theories have a tendency to erase the individual experience, the risks that we can sometimes perceive while looking at specific manuscripts. When we look at the little details that constitute manuscript culture in all ages, we see better the labor, the pain, the terror, sometimes of writing under very difficult circumstances. Medieval writers did not have it easy. the light was poor, the furniture was the contrary of ergonomic, the writing instruments were of a quality that would not match their need to write quickly, effectively, painlessly. 3 fingers work, the whole body suffers. Well, writing in the margins is even more painful, and also sometimes also more exciting. I don't think this is specific to medieval writers. Writing is always facing adverse circumstances and toiling to produce the right space and the right time to open up the flesh of the blank page, or when nothing else is available, perhaps the narrow margins of someone's book. There is a manuscript produced in the city of Toledo in the 8th century, while the city was still under Visigothic rule, that a monk decided to send to a friend in a Benedictine monastery in Verona. There, another monk, whether the friend or someone else, we don't know, started reading it. And as it happens, he had a pen or the equivalent to take notes in the margins. But first, he had to be certain that the pen worked and that the ink was impregnating the parchment. So he wrote a small riddle. Se pareva boves, alba pratalia araba, et albo versorio teneva, et negro semen seminava. The response was simply, the response to the riddle was the pen with which he was writing. The hand, he says, is like the oxen that are plowing the wide fields with a white plow, seeding it with black seed. This is a tiny microliterature, but in it we can understand how the activity of writing is like breaking the surface of the earth in order to put in it something that will bloom and therefore change the landscape, perhaps feed those who harvest it. He also reminds us that writing is physical as much as an intellectual work, and that the space that remains for writing on an already written book is scarce and must be used with care. The book you see here, this book that you see here, follows some of those micro-literary experience where I think they lead. And they perhaps use specific techniques to write in the margins, learned from books that were not necessarily written for them. They were written for monasteries whose cells they didn't inhabit, or for universities to whose classes they never attended, but that they saw and perused as alien objects that one wants to make their own. There are people who know just a tiny, these are people who know just a tiny bit of Latin and a tiny bit of other neighboring languages, and who want to create a style of writing that would be their own. And they felt that producing the margin as a site of thinking and as a site of writing was indeed a moment of illumination. Sometimes they feel the impulse to dispute everything, like the anonymous commentator of Pedro de Toledo's Castilian translation of Maimonides' Moreja Nebuchim, who would spend 20 folios of the book that he found in somebody else's library, writing furiously in the margins, between the lines, or wherever he could find a blank space to debate, and sometimes to insult the translator. I now remember that there are many manuscripts like that, openly polemical, those that I had forgotten before. Now I remember them. They are openly polemical, openly hostile, trying hard to discredit the work on the center of the page and to correct it with their own, now written in very small script for eyes that are definitely better than the ones I have now due to old age. Other micro-literary artists use the margins not to comment on other people's books, but rather to use all the cognitive and affective spaces available to them to create a multi-dimensional text that cannot be read in a straight line. You have to read it like with strabic eyes. There, they discuss or they theorize about contemporary issues. They even feel like they can produce legal thought or political ideas that would change their world in that moment. They are contemporary thinkers. Those are also some of the microliterary experiences I wanted to pay attention to. And I think I have consumed my time, and that I should now keep silence, but not without saying again the words that really matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for inviting me to be on this panel, and thanks to Lindsay and everyone at the Heyman for making this event possible. And thank you all for coming. There's so many of you here. It's a delight. And I'm so excited to talk about this book with these people. Feverish, crazed, aggressive, vegetal, offensive, expansive, humanist, authoritative, fractal, metamorphic, foundational, activist, political, normative, engaged, dialogic, restless, transformative, vernacular, probing, pleasurable, and most surprising of all, public. These are some of the adjectives Jesus uses to describe the microliteratures he studies in this astonishing book. The phenomenon under study, as you've already heard, is what we used to call marginal commentary or maybe gloss before his invention of the term microliterature. Jesus takes this phenomenon, which might seem idiosyncratic, private, and obscure, and shows how it counterintuitively belongs to the public sphere and has serious political stakes. This book, in other words, is a work of erudite alchemy. Microliteratures, he says, produce the contemporary by engaging with ideas from across time and bringing them into conversation with current quandaries related to political conflict and social justice. As he writes, quote, microliteratures are those that do not accept the weight of systemic structures of power, but would prefer to affect them. Along the way, Jesus offers sparkling redefinitions of signal concepts like public intellectual, activism, page, and material text. This book is indispensable for anyone interested in manuscripts, sure, but like Julie already mentioned, it's equally vital for anyone interested in how academic work can be a form of activism. Indeed, his stated goal is to bring the past, in this case, the medieval and early modern practice of microliterature, into contemporary debates, not as a sort of a pious cliche, like let's learn from history, but rather as an epistemological principle. Jesus resists the temptation of imposing an overarching framework on microliterary activities, yet he still investigates a coherent phenomenon, no matter how much he forgot, apparently. Quote, how certain intellectuals of the middle and early modern ages conquered, that's my emphasis, the margin, as a way of claiming an effective space for reading and study. For him, glosses are not primarily interpretive. Instead, they install a certain intellectual disposition. Not only does he make this case through lucid and compelling arguments in the main text, he equally proves his point through his own microliterary activity in the footnotes, which often feel like an intimate chat, but also nudge the reader into intellectual alignment with their author. He causes the strabismic reading that he claims for the glossed page in his medieval and early modern subjects of study. I found myself reaching for a pencil, almost despite myself, to join the conversations in the margins of my own dog-eared copy. One of the most striking chapters for me as a medievalist interested in manuscripts addresses the production of the margin, and it does so by means of a series of luminous metaphors for the glossed page. First, Jesus calls the page a territory with its own cartography and traffic, or adjacently, a territory on which to build, with the glosses serving as foundation and the main text as edifice. Or perhaps the glosses are part of the territory and the map to that same territory in an almost Borgesian coterminus. In another Borgesian moment, we are told that the territory of the page has a somewhat sinister potential to become a labyrinth. From there, Jesus posits that the gloss has satellite force, a compelling alternative to the Derridian supplement or to the idea that a gloss might simply complement the main text. Instead, like a satellite, the gloss alters that which it orbits around, causing a refocalization. In other words, the gloss, and hence the margin, is a space of action rather than reaction. In a final move, uniting in some ways the metaphors of territory and satellite, Jesus considers the margin as a locus of a network and polemic. This book offers invigorating methodological innovations for manuscript study. Jesus eschews source criticism in favor of thinking of gloss manuscripts as, quote, an experience, a process. Even, he goes on to say, quote, a risk, a form of testing everything in the process of subject formation. One signal risk the subject undertook, as we all do, was not being understood, and therefore not having any measurable impact on tradition. But, and here's where it gets interesting, Jesus refuses to see that misunderstanding or lack of understanding as a failure. Instead, these manuscripts offer the reader a challenge that exercises their critical thinking and might produce pleasure, in an analogy to the process that led to the glossator's activity in the first place. For the Portuguese Prince Pedro de Avis, the complex autoglossing activity he engages in is a pleasure that generates knowledge. In other words, as Jesus lucidly points out via, of all people, Edgar Allan Poe, glosses are an investment in a system that produces profits. They are an economic activity. Invest knowledge and get pleasure. Invest pleasure and get knowledge. As someone interested in the way that manuscripts can manipulate available readings, I want to conclude my remarks by mentioning some of the reading practices Jesus defines. Two of the most compelling for me were strabismic and serial reading. I had to look up the terrific technical word strabismic, which means, for those of you who are with me on that, cross-eyed or double vision. It's a medical word. It has a near synonym, but I think importantly not quite a synonym, in multifocal. Strabismic reading describes how it feels to toggle back and forth between the margin and the page, to feel one's attention be crossed or doubled. Serial reading, on the other hand, names a process of assemblage engendered by the contested territory of the gloss page, where different fragments arranged within themselves in discrete series might be encountered and reassembled in various orders by readers. For instance, a reader might construct a series that incorporates only those verses with rubrics that proclaim they are exempla, or only those glosses that are in Latin, or only stories related to Alexander the Great. Serial reading is fundamentally multiple, or to use Jesus's preferred term, perspectival. Serial reading is an experience, one that, when exercised on stories of the past, brings together historically disparate moments, teaching us how to relate to and enter into dialogue with history. Both strabismic and serial reading re-articulate and debate received wisdom about how readers navigate the page. But they do so in that wildly convincing way that had me saying, oh, but of course. So I have a few invitations for discussion that please feel free to take or leave. As I've said already, one thing that emerges very clearly in this book is the idea of microliterature as a public activity carried out in a public space, namely the margin. Yet this is counterintuitive in many ways, particularly before print, when manuscripts seem intimate and personal, as for that matter does the prefix micro. Could you expand on how you reconcile this seeming discrepancy? I do think it's seeming, but I just want to hear you talk about it more. And the other thing that even came up in your remarks is the assistance on the production of the margin as a task carried out in the vernacular sphere. That's a quote. Why is it a vernacular sphere? This is a book I will return to. And to return to Jesus's own metaphor of cartography, it offers a new, corrective, invigorating projection for the study of manuscripts, reading, and intellectual engagement with public life. If any of you haven't read it yet, you are missing out on a magisterial, charming, and invigorating intellectual experience. Thank you.
That's great, actually. Okay, welcome back, my dear friend. I am delighted to be sharing this space with you again. It's very exciting and moving. Thanks, Julie, for getting me into this. When Julie sent out the invitation, there's been a very flattering note. I said, "Oh my God!" But I have to deal with really one of the most erudite persons I've ever encountered in my life, and we are in a room of extraordinary achievement. Okay. But there's a kind of erudition that Jesus has that is definitely singular. And of course, I'm not a medievalist, so that was the kind of always a point of befuddlement. But Julie assured me, she said, "Be yourself," which is a terrible thing to say because it unleashes. Exactly. So usually when I do these things, I really love commenting on books is really a lot of fun. I speak off the cuff. That's sort of my mode. So I thought I really didn't think I could do this off the cuff. So I wrote it down, and in fact, it's a kind of microliterary take on your microliterature. So what I've done is I have these 6 very short sections, which are commentaries on specific phrases. Starting with, of course, and Hannah mentioned a few of them, starting with a series of terms that come very early. The term one is microliterary intensity. That happens on, Roman numeral 15, but that's the 15th leaf of the book. So very early, second page. The magic of small handwriting, that's on page 2, and a microliterary attitude, which he extrapolates on page 11. So these phrases or characterizations, which I isolate here as introductory footprints, speak of a certain sensibility that does not actually belong to the microliterary subjectivity, despite the fact that some human hand or pen is doing the writing. Rather, they evoke a sensibility intrinsic to the art itself. So microliterature is an art form that exudes a complexity of affect, which I imagine as a sort of radiation that emanates from the page, first into the eye that strains to receive it. I think it's patently false and problematic to consider the eye to be penetrating the space of the page in order to conquer the microscopic writing. So first to the eye that strains to receive it, and second into the mind that is forced to adjust itself to the spatial disorientation in the act of reading, which is further burdened by the microtextually conjured supplementary meaning. The eye strains and the mind stretches, subjected and seduced by intensity and magic. Now, because of course, I've written on the margins of my text because I can't help it. This could be linked also to the acousmatic and to those questions of rhythm that you bring in later in the reading process. I'll talk a little bit about that, but I didn't have a chance to elaborate it. Jesus mentions the acousmatic as a certain way of seeing, which I think is this synesthetic element here is very important. Okay, the second, the phrases that I chose are the following. While the space may be minimal, it must be exploited to the maximum. Marginal writing may be expansive, but it is adjacent to something already given in relation to which it constitutes a microliterature. So I want to isolate here the phrase something already given. It is this fact that constitutes its authority, its status quo, the fact that it is already given. What is given is the foremost target object of the critical act, which to the extent that criticism actually takes place, undoes this given by rendering it questionable, doubtful, open to interpretation or to judgment. Jesus quotes this by alerting us to a very specific process of the critical faculty. I quote, "When we look at microliterature, we see its most prominent activity, thinking with." He then goes on to mark thinking with as the quintessential mode of critical thought, not a typical way to put it, as it de-emphasizes analysis and reflection. If critical thought under the parameters of reflexivity and unmasking is often seen as a sort of redoubling, here the redoubling happens not by dialysis, by the dissolution of authority, but by mere juxtaposition, not by pursuing clarity, but by casting a shadow. As I like to remind with my philologist hat on, myself and others, the word krisis means foremost distinction among a field of objects and simultaneously an act of judgment inherent in this distinction, which in the end means an attribution of value by virtue of this distinction. No matter what the critic might think, there is nothing neutral about the critical act. It always inheres a politics. It's a decision. It attributes value. Because to think critically is to press judgment onto what is given, so that it is no longer simply given, critical thought is often seen as a sort of Aufhebung sort of gesture, and for those who don't quite approve it or are afraid of it, as a secondary revision or a kind of intervention, even a violation of the authorial original. So to associate critical thought with juxtaposition, with the creation of adjacency to what is given, changes the paradigm at the level of the image, if nothing else, because one moves laterally, horizontally, and not vertically, as is the typical conception, where in the critic's delusions of interpretive grandeur, one either aspires for the sky or the secret underbelly of the text. Same difference. I love same difference, actually. It's one of my favorite terms. What a crazy term in the English language, same difference. Really, just think about it. Anyway, move on. Third, now I have these two sets of phrases that are kind of counter to each other. Not counter, but they're adjacent. Okay. The authority of the center must be conquered because it does not surrender easily to a siege. In the same camp, the margin is always beseeching the center and sometimes managing to deactivate it. And versus or yet as, I don't know, the other two phrases, the margins are there, they do not need to be there. And the context is a model to be assembled, which is an extraordinary phrase that I truly love, and I'll say a few things about it. So I want to start from the last assertion, the margins are there, they do not need to be there. The standard analysis of marginalia versus the authorial center is predicated on an unexamined acceptance of relationality, starting with the authority of the main text that enables the marginal existence and then growing toward an account of the marginal as possibly autonomous, or relatively autonomous, to use a phrase from the Marxist canon. Marginalia comes to achieve its own textual authority within this relation. But Jesus is alerting us here to an important dimension that is often forgotten. There is no necessary relation. Relation emerges as a prism because of the sheer presence of the paratext. Nothing necessitates the paratext. Not even the text to which it is paratactically linked. Some might even come to say parasitically linked. Whatever the parameter, and pardon me for my Hellenic grammatology, I'm indulging. The relation is neither necessary nor causal, but arbitrary and retroactive. It is because of the margin that the text can be in the center of authorial gravitas. That's actually a no-brainer, but we have to just think of it that way. It's because of the microliterary presence that the literary authority can be cemented. From that perspective, then, we can talk of how the beseeching, the centering, deactivating, and conquering may indeed come to happen. The microliterary unleashes a force that is indeed autonomous in the sense of intrinsic, non-relative at all. The fact remains that the margin is just there. It doesn't have to be there. It just is. It's a profound observation that really elucidates the splendid phrase, the context is a model to be assembled. That is to say, never given in advance. This, to my mind, enables us to engage in a sort of enabling decontextualization that opens up the rigor of interpretation instead of weakening it, as it is often argued. Now, I can imagine historians will kill me for saying this, but unless you're Foucault, because I was teaching class this morning, I remembered it. Foucault talks about the unrealized instances of history as a material presence that needs to be, in fact, encountered. Anyway, we can leave that aside. 4, a longer sentence. The order and presence of marginal comments are optional and sometimes so excessive that they have been erased, summarized, abbreviated, turned into compendia, or forgotten. If still alive, they're fragile in a minority state that we call microliterary. This notion very much follows from the point above. If context is a model to be assembled, then no relation is necessary and therefore intrinsically imperative. that includes the notion of authority of the text as original center. Instead, the marginal exists precisely so as to accentuate its ephemeral nature, the fact that it has emerged in an arbitrary contingent moment, and for this reason can equally vanish in yet another such conjuncture. You can think of this actually in material terms, how, say, the penciled marks on the page fade earlier than the typescript. Their own material nature tends towards them becoming illegible. The minority state is meaningful, of course, only as relation to a state that exists at the center. Otherwise, the term is not very useful and may even cause a misapprehension that would tend to fetishize the textual precariousness of marginalia, something that obviously I would want to avoid, and I imagine Jesus also, but he can speak to this perhaps. I'd like to imagine something else. Its arbitrariness makes the marginal text particularly powerful in that it ultimately decenters the authorial original. One can easily channel Derrida's supplementarity here. I mean, Jesus brings this up, that's why I'm saying it. I don't want to indulge in this direction, though obviously there is something to say about that relation. In any case, it decenters the marginalia, it decenters the authorial original because one, it points out to what the authorial original lacks. Otherwise, why the commentary? And second, that the authorial original was also once a margin to some other text, real or imagined. Now, real or imagined, I'm moving from Derrida to Borges here, which makes me a lot more comfortable. From this Borgesian labyrinthian perspective, the precariousness of the microliterary no longer matters because it is part of a potentially terminable flow. The context is a model to be assembled. I think here the discussion of rhythm of the adjacent reading is incredibly important. And I don't know if there is a break. I of course, has to do with how I read. First of all, as an aside, it's remarkable that your publisher, Cornell University Press, allowed you to have footnotes, which is something I demand with vehemence. And lately I've been getting defeated. Because, they're telling you it cannot be read on the phone. And it ends up in endnotes. So footnotes is actually not a scholarly apparatus, my argument is. It is, in fact, the most essayistic apparatus. You read it in the context of reading without a break. Okay, last point. Microliterature is a form of production within written culture, a feverish, somewhat crazed activity, also a humanistic activity performed in the public sphere, as well as an enduring manifestation of the essay genre. Okay, in linking it to the essay form, which I very much understand and applaud, microliterature means it is at once open-ended and always linked to trial, and of course, in that respect, failure. The curious thing about marginalia is that although they derive their existence by virtue of a notion of limit, what is adjacent, off-center, etc., they are by definition unbounded, excessive, Jesus says. And it is true that one might argue that the end of the page is a boundary, yet the fact that marginal writing turns inward into an ever more microsphere by letters becoming smaller and smaller in order to defy the boundary of the page, filling every space imaginable on the page, and even creating space where there is none precisely by becoming smaller and smaller and so on. All this suggests very much a marginal infinity, if I may put it that way. The essay, of course, is quintessentially an unfinished infinite, the way I write it, mode of writing. Its limit may be its last full point on the page, but that is just a theatrical gesture that only feigns a curtain fall. The reader who remains seduced and befuddled, that's how the essay works, and this is what great essays do to us, thankfully, feels this trick in their flesh and bones. Full point is never quite full. Same when one is writing on the margins. The micro letter is never finally small. There's always room for more and more micro. But I want to return to the quotation here and emphasize the assertion that this takes place in the public sphere. Again, contrary to the conventional notion that the essay is a kind of self-coded form that says more about the author than the subject matter, the essay is a profoundly dialogic form that invites a sort of sharing, even with the reader befuddled, in a way that surely the treatise doesn't. This is the irony. The philosophical mode that claims to speak objectively and analytically is more self-referential to its authorial subject than is the literary mode of the essay, which is no doubt very personal, but is nonetheless abandoned fully to its object and to the public with which this object is shared. Here, Derrida's wondrous aporia, which Jesus invokes when there are margins, is there a philosophy, written, by the way, in an essay, not in a philosophical text, okay, resounds profound. I want to press on this matter, and this is what Jesus thought elicits for me. Although our tendency is to read marginalia as an insight into the soul of the reader-author, the point is that the window is onto the soul of the reader-public. Reading, and this is an example, reading some time ago Hannah Arendt's comments on the margins of Carl Schmitt's The Nomos of the Earth said a hell of a lot more about the world in which the reading encounter happened than the world of Arendt the writer, or Schmitt the writer for that matter. In any case, yes, microliterature is a form of production, and no form of production can be single-handed and private. And a final word on strabismic reading. As literally a strabismic reader suffering from hypermetropia in one eye, I surely relate to this notion. What matters in Jesus's use is that what I was trying to account for in my description of critical thought early on. If we do let go of any notion of mastery in the critical act, then the experience of reading as a misaligned activity in regard to our person liberates both the object of reading, the text, and our person. Neither needs to be burdened with being deciphered or decipherable, deciphering. The cipher suffices. The microliterary intensity that Jesus is evoking means precisely to reside abandoned upon this cipher. This is not to say I'm being an obscurantist or that I disparage the hermeneutical act. What I'm intending to restore to the hermeneutical act is its proper name, the act of Hermes, the undecipherable God, the neither this or that androgyny of the messenger who never quite knows what she might be giving forth or receiving hence in terms of meaning. The context is a model to be assembled. Thank you.
All right, well, it's very moving to be back here with you among us, Jesus, to have you back in our community, and Aurélie, and to be surrounded by so many friends in this space. So thank you. Thanks, Julie, for putting this together. So I was particularly taken in this discussion by the 10-page gloss by Gregorio Lopez in the second of the Siete Partitas, which, for many reasons, but it was written in the 16th century. And it's this remarkable 10-page marginalia that does an extraordinary, stunning amount of work, legal work, defining and creating a whole theory of just war. And it's amazing how much law he is able to achieve and make, all right, in the margin, while taking the position, which he takes the position, that violence should only serve as a reaction and not as a foundation of law. But when you start to read the gloss, it's just stunning, right? First, it's the kings of Spain who have the right to conquer America. Small little marginal claim. Second, that conquest should be accomplished by preaching, not by force of arms, right? Third, clear distinction should be made and enforced between the converted and the not yet converted. I mean, and it just goes on, right? Eighth, war is caused by the violence of others, right? 9, And the only one that does not make a positive proposal is a total rejection of the earlier doctrines, right? What power in the margin in interpreting the siete partitas. So now, of course, as Jesus notes on page 100, lawyers, representatives, judges, and other in the legal professions drew from the arguments of Lopez's glosses more than they did from the text of the partitas. So then it becomes, of course, the most influential way to think about these issues. And so the marginal note, I take it, is the ruse here, and has continued throughout history in different forms. The forms that I think of, for instance, are the commentary, William Blackstone's commentaries. These are just commentaries, right? It's not making the law. It's just a side thing like the marginalia, referred to again as a just commentary. But of course, what he was able to achieve, Blackstone, by doing that was to simply define what the common law of England was. And that was his intention, and that was what he achieved. He redefined English common law. Coke did the same. We had Story here, who was a famous professor here in the 19th century, who did the same for New York law. We had other efforts like that to just kind of create something that effectively then becomes the dominant interpretation on the side. The Model Penal Code, again, here, Herbert Wexler, who created that. And then you could even think in later periods during the 1970s and the critical legal studies movement, actually, it was all done in the footnotes, these lengthy footnotes that hid the structuralism and the Marxism and the Gramsci and the et cetera. And all of this, in a way, highlights, of course, the role of the academy in creating these forms of power. It's interesting, you note on page 88 that the Siete Partitas becomes a text in the curriculum of the Faculty of Laws, right? It is imposed into the curriculum, and then it's through that way that it and its glosses kind of come to the center of the canon. So I take it that your book, Jesus, is a manual of how to exercise power. It's a Machiavellian, in a way, manual of how, and a study of relations of power, something in the vein of, a discipline and punish, right? A deep dive into the way in which power circulates in society through the pages of the gloss and the interaction with the text. In all this, I see nothing but power, not a humanistic activity. I don't know what you mean by that. And all of this talk of humanism, I don't know. What is that about? You say that your book proposes a thesis, the following thesis, that microliterature is a humanistic activity performed in the public sphere. I think somehow you're selling yourself short. Elsewhere, you say, again, kind of like what this book is. This is where we go polyhedric. But my ultimate thesis is how certain intellectuals of the middle and early modern ages conquered the margin as a way of claiming an effective space for reading and study. Again, I think you're selling this a little bit short here. I think I would call it a genealogy of power. And the question would then be, how does this function today? Right? So I take it there's still a big role for marginalia. And actually, we have a student, a brilliant senior here at Columbia, Isha Karim, in the corner, hiding, but who is writing her senior thesis about the way that marginal writings function in and take over the center, right? In this kind of relations of power. She's discovered in making an archive. And so our archive of the marginal notes made in the books in the library in a special collection in Butler, which is for kind of first generation students. And they are really stunning, the comments, and it basically kind of transforms the text. You can't read the text without reading these sometimes violent, but other times funny, other times just whatever it's like. So they're still, okay, so I take it, it's still operating that way. There's, of course, the footnotes. I mean, even though, as Stathis was saying, there's a limitation on them, they still operate there. You mentioned hypertext a lot. You mentioned and discuss hypertext, and I think would be important to think about. I think you dismiss it as a form of, it feels as if you're dismissing it a little bit, as if not functioning as well, maybe. But then the question would be, what else is there, right? What is there today that is operating in this way to actually achieve so much? And I'm not sure. That's something I think we need to ask ourselves. People are going to immediately jump to social media. I don't know, okay, whatever. There's something about the blueprint or the white paper, I think, today that might be this kind of document that's not privileged, that's not in the center, and yet does all the work. I think for maybe something like, the mandate for leadership of the Heritage Foundation, which is just supposed to be a kind of a little bit of a blueprint or something like that. But actually, it turns out it's like, that's, it's the marching orders, right? It's all there. It was all there. It's all there. I don't know. We could be thinking about podcasts also and video and YouTube as other forms somehow, which are displacing our books, for instance, and all of our academic production. But in any event, I think that would be the question then, is to kind of like to try and actualize what it is in the margins that is doing the kind of work that Lopez was able to do in such a violent way, and in such a hidden way. And then the one final thought is just also, it is remarkable when I read through this to see the way in which it operates through faculties so often, which reflects the hidden power of faculties and makes me puzzled at how it is that the current presidential administration at times seems to want to diminish rather than seize and kind of achieve what could have been achieved in these more devious ways, by controlling somehow rather than diminishing these institutions. And so I realize that there are competing tendencies in Washington, some of which are about seizing these institutions and having more conservative professors teach the core curriculum or something like that. So I mean, it's not, but it seems as if one dominant strand is diminishing the institutions. What I find so interesting here are all of the ways in which you can actually operate, how it's so essential in terms of power relations to operate through these institutions deviously, as it were. Okay, so I think that's what I wanted to say. Yeah, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Um, um, Thank you so much. This is, you know, what happens when you write a book is, or when I write a book at least, not that I've written like thousands of books,
Yes.
but you know, I've written a small number of them. And then I always tend to forget about them, to forget what they say, how they say it. And sometimes when somebody reads them to you, back to you, they sound alien. They sound like, you know, also because they are not read to you in the order in which you wrote them, but rather in fragments, in glosses, extracting elements from them, putting them aside, putting them under the microscope. And then you realize that you need to read that not with your own eyes that linearly, you know, go through the text that you've written, but you have to be internally strabic. You have to be internally cross-eyed in your own soul, in your own intellect, and then try to make sense of perhaps all those things. There is something, so I think that you've made incredible comments that enlighten parts of the book for me, perhaps not for anybody else, but certainly for me, and that give me the ability and the gift of reflecting on my own imperfect and imperfect style that I am always trying to build. That's all I try to do. How do I write, and how do I do so that what I think comes out in a textual form that is understandable. And sometimes what you do is like you kind of tied your hands together. You don't let yourself go deep enough into that. You establish your own limits. You see the end of the page. You see the end of the margin, and you cannot exceed it. You cannot cross it. And sometimes, you know, do I sell myself short? I don't think so. I do whatever I can, because I reach only this much. So being in conversation with you is the gift that gives me a tiny little bit, or perhaps a lot more, of margin to continue writing on it. For instance, I'm not going to address everything you've told me, because it would be too difficult for me. I am, I cannot just improv complex answers to extraordinarily complex questions or comments that you have made. But I want to say a few things that are related to what you said in no particular order. One of them is the question of the public. What kind of work does the public do here? And sure, I wrote public sphere, and I'm certain that the public is a sphere. I am, maybe it has that shape, or maybe it has a different shape. I am not sure. I think that Habermas doesn't mention a particular shape. He says oftenly something, and that's open-ended. It's like the public. It's a public thing, but a sphere is a nice shape, and so public sphere. But it's counterintuitive to think public and manuscript. That is certain. And yet, somehow, I think there is little more public than the manuscript interaction. Why is that? Because that moment of handwriting is also the moment of authenticity, of bodily contact, of incorporation. You can not take a manuscript, old or new, without in a certain way accepting the power of the body that has produced it, the labor of the body that has produced it, the intimacy of the object itself. So, but this is perhaps a little bit abstract or a little bit, sure, yeah, that's bullshit. Essentially, I would say, perhaps to myself, because I say those things to myself, and in private. Sorry, but
Another pump.
another public.
Yeah.
Yes. But also there is this thing is that manuscript books define their space. Unlike perhaps printed books that can be exchanged, put here, there, discarded, sent away, burned, well, manuscripts can be burned too. But the manuscript defines its own space. So they have this power of attraction. You want to go to the manuscript. You want to be in contact with it. You have to do a work of deciphering without properly deciphering it. You have to understand the kind of ruse that it wants to do for you. I like that. I like you mentioned Hermes. There is this beautiful 6th century text by Marcianus Capella. Marcianus is a great name, by the way. If I had another child, I would probably call him Marcianus, because what a great, yeah, I know. Marcianus, come here. Let's play. But he wrote about the marriage of Mercurius and philology. And the myth is this: Mercurius is looking for a wife. He can't find one. And he tries here and there, psyche, yeah, sure, but no, I don't wanna. Another one, yes, well, but I am a virgin, then perhaps not, and things like that. So Apollo, who is clearly, drunk, and he is in Mount Parnassus, says, I have the perfect candidate for you. She is philology. Oh, great, excellent, wonderful. So the messenger of the gods, the one who carries those incomprehensible but legal messages, the real messages of authority, is marrying philology, who is in charge of doing exactly what Hermes doesn't want her to do, which is try to interpret those texts. That's the tension. And philology tells him, well, there's a problem. It's that I am immortal and you aren't. So how do we do that? And then a friend there by the name of Athanasia, so immortality, says, oh, no worries, I have a filter. And then drink the filter. And she drinks the filter. And the first thing she feels is nausea. She vomits. And she vomits and vomits and vomits. What does she vomit? Books, 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 all the sciences with their marginal commentaries. So the thing is that in the mythology of hermetic knowledge, there is a moment in which the discipline comes not just as a vomit of mortality and liberating mortality, but also it comes with the marginal knowledge. And then these vernacular writers have to fight against that, have to produce their own knowledge or their own willingness to transform the society in which they live, or perhaps to make believe that they understand what this law or this political text can do for us. Why the vernacular, you asked? And I don't know the answer to that question. I think that there is something about the affective space of the vernacular, of vernacular knowledge. Vernacular, which comes from vernus, which is the domestic servant. So in a certain way, the vernacular is all that is domestic, and it's also your servant. You don't have to serve it. You can reuse it, reinvent it. You can modify a language that is not fully formed, that doesn't have yet a grammar, like many vernaculars in the Middle Ages didn't, except for Provençal poets, at that in this period, there is not yet a grammar. So this grammar is up for grabs. It's something to be reinvented. And sometimes it's reinvented in those texts, in those marginal texts that at the same time that create ideas, they create the way to say those ideas. They create the concepts, they create the conceptual map to talk about that. But again, I am not sure what are my answers. I don't think I have answers. I have now elements to reflect on. I think I have gratitude for you because you have read this, because you are now telling me how can I continue writing if I ever do, which I'm not completely sure. And I am a little bit concerned now about, I'm always concerned about one thing is that I'm a medievalist. So what, right? Middle Ages, except for Hannah, she is a great medievalist. But I'm a medievalist. What does it matter what I do? And in a certain way, and I don't know the answer to that. I cannot make the interpretation of the past speaking to the present. I don't want to do that. I am uniquely unqualified to do that. I teach my classes. My students sometimes do that. And they tell me why that concept or that analysis or that idea or that thing that they read suddenly illuminates something that they didn't exactly how to put into words. I guess that's more or less all. The blueprint and the manuscript. There is a story that always fascinates me, and that speaks to the power of the manuscript, the power of the time that you spend creating the manuscript, and the mistakes that you make creating the manuscript. So the Constitutional Assembly, the American Constitutional Assembly, how did they write the Constitution? They met, discussed, and at the end of the day, they printed it out. They printed it out in a newspaper printing press. They printed it out. They created that. The following day or the following week or whatever, they were based on that printed page, and they discussed it, corrected it, etc. And at the end of the day, they reprinted it. And that, after destroying each printed page, we know we still preserve some of them. And when they had printed enough of them and discussed them and made all the changes, then they asked a scribe to do a manuscript version of that would be the final copy of the Constitution, which is the one that is in the Library of Congress in an exhibit. And this, they gave him, I don't remember the name of the engrosser, but they gave him 48 hours. And he wrote that in 48 hours and made so many mistakes that he asked for a little bit more of time to just create a list of those mistakes. So it's he made his own philological, his own microliterature. And then you have that exposed, public, there for you to be seen as the authentic, ultimate moment of nation creativity. Thank you.
Um, power. I'm sure Jesus or others would be happy to take questions,
Especially others.
especially others. Back there,
Maristela.
Maristella.
Have we got a microphone
by the way? Yes.
I can bring him.
Yes.
Perhaps some.
Sorry, but I'm going to be terribly biologically deterministic and because he hates that about me. But
Do I?
I have to ask this. Well, it's the last time we discussed it, you didn't change them. So
You convinced me.
yeah, I don't know. It seems to me that everything I've heard from here, especially the last part about transposing this to our present time, social media content, video, audio, and the reaction of people to it, right? The obvious, I don't know, pacification of commentary and of reaction commentary to things. To me, harkens back to even the first productions of those margins that you talk about, especially remembering more than the 10-page glosses and so on and so forth, the doodling and the little just things on the margins of manuscripts. That it takes me to the point that to me it seems that the affect and the pleasure are the point of it. That what underlies, what connects all of the reading has said here is that everyone who's doing it, 10 pages or a doodle, they're doing it because it's pleasurable, because it's rewarding. And isn't that the point? Isn't that intellectual work? I guess, I'm sorry to say that in this room, because I guess we all want to think our intellectual work has more than just a search for pleasure, but in the end, we do it because it's pleasurable, because it's rewarding. And it does seem to me, I don't know to what extent you know, but in the end, that eagerness to be part of that text, to inscribe yourself in that text, even if just by doodling on it or putting your shopping list on it or whatever you do, is coming from that to experience that dopamine high now, that age of the dopamine high, right? And of the strab, whatever. Watching videos really listening to music at the same time. It's kind of like an ultra manifestation of anything you're describing. So I guess these first people, like first commentators and just like the dopamine junkies, and just that tendency, you know, taken to its like ridiculous extreme.
Thank you, Maristela. Yes and no. No, I made the point in the book. At a certain moment, I say, well, there is these activities afford pleasure, and there is a politics of pleasure, and there is, and I talk about that a little bit at length in the book, saying precisely and evoking Poe that you mentioned as well, who says, I'm going to criticize John Stuart Mill, who thinks that profit is not something that can be related to pleasure, and then you can see here how, there is another way to look at profit, and there is another way to look at pleasure, and one of them is exactly that, how that kind of interaction in a perhaps very small public sphere, but public sphere nevertheless, produces that kind of pleasure, that kind of social respect, etc., etc. I want to say that yes, the dopamine junkies are similar. I also want to say that, and because Bernard asked about that too, about the question of the similarities between glosses or social media and so on and so forth with marginal glosses, the kind of manuscript glosses that I talk about. I think that one of the things that happens when you are in the world of hypertext or in the world of YouTube or social media, etc., is that each click hides the previous one. And then you enter in a process of cancellation, technical. You cancel the previous one. It's not present anymore. And the third click that you make, you've already forgotten the first one. So in a certain way, there is a shadow or a phantasm of that, but it's not present. However, in the manuscript, everything is present at all times. So that's why you cannot read like in the antero-posterior axis as you normally do in the internet, but you have to do it like this, you know, in this kind of Stravic form. And that is perhaps also pleasure, but it is a completely different kind of pleasure. It is a pleasure that derives from the fact of from presence that rather than from this kind of cancellation. I don't know if that makes sense. It's something that I just said.
You know, let me just say something, because I mean, but maybe the clicking takes you elsewhere, right? In the way in which the marginalia was also taking you elsewhere. I mean, it takes you away from the text, right? And the idea is that it's going to then kind of monopolize you, or you know, or change the way you interpreted that text or something. So I mean, maybe there is something there about as a device of you know, because this is, I take it, it is about moving our attention away from, right, from the text to something else that then becomes the most important kind of item in one's consciousness. I don't know. Anyway, but
No, I think that's right. But for instance, and that's why I say there is no way to create a one single all-encompassing theory of that. Right. Because in some cases, you can see this tension. I want to move away from that center. That center allows me to do this, but at the same time, I despise it. I don't want it. It's there just for you to insult it or for you to ignore it willingly. It's there, but you have to pay attention to me. But in other cases, it's like, for instance, Peter of Portugal or Diego de Valera or these other people, they are commenting their own texts. They are creating a central text and then all kind of marginal interactions in which they don't want to hide themselves. They want to do something different with themselves. They want you to think in many different ways with the way in which you speak or write to you. So it's and it is more serial, and at the same time, you see, for instance, one thing that is important is le bornage. So the signs that are used in the manuscript, in manuscript culture, to send you from one point to another and back. That sometimes you can't see easily online. For instance, you can click here, and then that here is a link. But then there are 1,000 here's, and then you have lost track of what was the primitive here that you had to click, or just simply click on this link, and then click on this link, and then click on this link. Yes, go ahead.
No, I mean, the materiality is considerably different.
It's considerably.
That's for me.
Yeah.
It's different materiality.
Right. Whereas, you know, in the manuscript, you always, you can get lost if you want. You are in a labyrinth, but also you have elements that lead you, that can guide you in that labyrinth. They are colors, they are signs, they are forms that tell you how to, you know, how to get back, or if you don't want to, you don't have to. But or sometimes it's a ruse in itself. You can go back, but it will be different. You know, now it's going to be different. Or you can go back, but first read this other gloss, because, you know, remember, you know, there are many different glosses that talk about that person, Alexander the Great, for instance. You know, and then once you have read them all, then come back to to this part of the poem or this part of the narrative. I don't know. It's you know, it's I think it's there are many elements that are similar, but they're extremely different as well in that sense.
Thank you for this, and to this too. It's a great way to start the semester to have this kind of a conversation. I wanted to ask you a simple question about whether there was a relationship to microhistory in your thinking process. Because, sorry, this is the historian coming all of a sudden spoiling the party. But because so far I've heard you talking a lot about the text and the marginalia. And that's obviously also analogous to what microhistorians do to a certain extent. They find another object of study on a much smaller scale. But in microhistory, the real purchase is the variation of scale. Basically, it's not that you're looking for something else, at something else. You're looking at the same thing, but you're doing what Jacques Revel called le jeu d'échelle, right? You're changing the scale of analysis to then be able to say something different about the larger story too. So I've heard a bit about that, about the sort of going back and forth, but I'm wondering if it was part of your thinking process, and if it's obviously I need to read the book, but just if that was part of what you were thinking about.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. And the thing is that what is the work that prefixes do? You know, micro. It's and how they signify so many things, either materially or symbolically, etc. And how do they engage with like these other terms or concepts? And I think that's a fair question. And my first answer to that is I'm not sure. But I always have a second answer. The first one is defensive. It's like I don't know because I'm an ignorant. But there is another possible question that I am rather thinking with you, because I am not sure it was something that I was thinking at first, which is how when you engage with many of these texts, in many occasions, I would say in almost all occasions, they ask you not just to move to the margin to read something, but also to move to the margin to read something that is in itself a kernel that will allow you to build a different narrative on your own, or going back to the text with the constellation of micro narratives that are being built by this text. Let me give you an example. Diego de Valera. I'm sure you've never seen him in the subway. It's a 15th century Spanish guy. He was a plebeian, and then he was very happy to be a plebeian, because only if you are a plebeian, you can become a nobleman. Otherwise, you're stuck. You're stuck. You know, and then, but you can't. You're just a hindrance. You're a nuisance, because you are given to the high society. Whereas if you're a plebeian and you're good, you can be made noble. Right.
And then what?
And then do things. Not paying taxes, for instance. That's some things that they did with that. But anyway, Diego de Valera, interesting. He is listening around. He is listening. And he says, I'm tired of what I'm listening, because you all are misogynists. And then he writes a mansplaining treatise that he calls In Defense of Virtuous Women. The genre, and the mansplaining. Of course, I mean, not you personally, because you've read those texts. Yes, on the subway. Yes, but he decides to do that, and then he creates two levels of interpretation. One is theoretical. Why is it important that we pay attention to the histories and to the lives of women. And then another marginal one in which he engages with micro-narratives of each of these women that allow you to create a larger scale of beliefs, practices, politics, legal engagement, and so on and so forth. So in a certain way, many of those manuscripts with their microliterary products, they are at their time, at their turn, like challenging perhaps the microhistorical drive. And they are also sources for that. And they are sources for that, and they have been sources for that kind of work for microhistorians who have, in fact, very often read marginal accounts of, for instance, a legal case in civil law and in the margins of the Corpus Juris Civilis, for instance, you have lots of cases, no? And then from those cases on, we have seen products that are about fictions in the archive or other micro-historical accounts. So in a certain way, I think, yes, there is a close relation to that. But unlike, for instance, the legal archive, where many of those, like the inquisitorial archive, or the legal archive of other, the civil archive, whatever. Instead of that, you have that in private or semi-private libraries, in the manuscripts that were going from hand to hand or that were being visited by different people in different times and that have perhaps done that kind of work as well. Too long? Yeah, sorry.
So I just wanted to come back to sort of questions at the end about institutions and marginalia, and this ties into some of the things that Stathis was saying too, is how can we think about, in the current crisis moment, philology being mobilized to make some kind of political intervention on certain kinds of documents? That's a very broad and abstract question, but in my own thinking, it's about moment of conception in reproductive justice questions and how conception can be, in a sense, philologized and politicized. So it's a sort of general, and it seems to me that the sort of pointed situating of something that's litotically powerful in a note or a margin, where you could almost pass it unnoticed, but on the other hand, it's almost a gimmick because, oh yeah, it's about hiding the meaning of this in the margin. It's a story. So, but regardless of that politicking of the text, it seems to me there's another politics, which is the larger one about philology as a sort of side or oblique way that doesn't seems fusty and old-fashioned, but it can actually have this kind of extraordinary rhetorical, genealogical, conceptual force.
Well, thank you very much. Perhaps it was addressed to me, I guess, and I like very much this question. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not completely sure anymore, but I studied philology, and I've always thought that maybe we have tried very hard to erase philology from many of our departments, disciplines, and so on and so forth. But there is one instance that has never done that, and that's lawyers, and how constitutional law, either originalists or not, are developing an extraordinarily important philological practice, either in the creation of textuality and how textuality, conveys and applies and comments on the law, or, for instance, in the interpretation of concepts, the constitutional order, the legal order in general. And Foucault knew that very well when he was giving the first seminar at the Collège de France, Leçon sur la volonté de savoir, is that we want to understand penal codes today. We have to study criminal law and penal law in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, because law is created to be durable. But language changes, and the relationship, the semantic relationships change, and lawyers have to practice this philological alchemy to make sure that the meaning of a certain word given in a certain context or assembled with a certain context means something that can then continue this reflection on law. When we see the decisions or the opinions or the dissents even in the Supreme Court, we see philology at work. We see in the question of reproductive justice that you mentioned before, the opinions that how do you say that? Against Roe v. Wade, these have, I'm sorry? Yes, Alito. Samuel Alito. He's an extraordinarily subtle philologist. And because philology doesn't play any role in the academic world, we are perhaps eager to buy it somehow, or the questions of the Second Amendment and what does weapon mean, or what, all those things, And I was looking at civil codes, so civil codes in the continental tradition and so on and so forth, and the second, third article in almost all of them, in the Italian, Spanish, in the Philippines, and it's words mean what they meant at the moment in which this was written. What an incredibly powerful assertion. And then it says, or whatever they mean for any reasonable person, which is completely false, because that doesn't exist. Only a philological approach to that, the interpretive work that you do, is what matters really there. So I think this question of philology is incredibly important.